Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar. My name is Jonathan Maudsley. I am the Science Advisor at the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. It's our pleasure on behalf of AFWA to be hosting this afternoon's webinar with Dr. Tom Edwards, who is Research Ecologist and Professor at the USGS Utah Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit and Department of Wildlands Resources at Utah State University. This afternoon's webinar is entitled Assessing Decision Risk in Species Range Maps and Distribution Models for Use in Conservation and Management. And before we get going today, I'd like to take a minute to provide some housekeeping details for everyone on today's call. First of all, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, our friends at USGS Ecosystems, particularly Ann Kinzinger and her staff at the USGS Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit program, including our good friend Dr. John Organ, who recently retired, our good friend Dr. John J.T. Thompson, who is currently the acting chief of the CRU program, and everyone at USGS Ecosystems and the Co-op Research Unit program. A couple notes to be aware of. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be made available on AFWA's YouTube channel at some point after the completion of the webinar. To access this recording and other webinars that we've conducted with USGS Ecosystems and other federal partners, I would advise you to go to Google and type in AFWA, AFWA YouTube channel, and that will bring up, the first thing that will come up will be our YouTube channel where you can find links to recordings of this webinar and other similar webinars that we have hosted in the past. One other housekeeping detail, we have a very large audience on today's webinar. It's currently well over 100 people and climbing, so we ask that if possible, please put your own phone on mute so that we don't get extraneous noises here. If necessary, I'm prepared to mute all the lines and just turn up Dr. Edwards, but in the meantime, we ask for courtesy's sake, please put your phone on mute if you're not the person speaking. Lastly, I'd point out that we have a chat box feature where you can ask questions directly of Dr. Edwards. In the lower left-hand corner of your screen, there's a little box. I've put a couple messages there already about how to access the audio portion of today's webinar. And if you have a question for Dr. Edwards, there's no need to hold it until the end. If you just want to type it there in the chat box, when we get to the end of the presentation, if we have time, we'll go through those in the order in which they were submitted. I'll read them. Dr. Edwards will have a chance to respond. If time permits, we'll go into a more conventional Q&A format where people can ask questions directly of Dr. Edwards. But we know that questions pop up during the course of the webinar, and so we want to give you that opportunity to provide them in the chat box before the end of the presentation. Co-hosting with me today is our good friend and colleague Jen Mock-Schaefer with the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. Jen, are you on the line?
I am. Good afternoon, Jonathan. Good afternoon, Dr. Edwards.
Would you like to say a few? Yeah.
Yes, I would. Just shortly, thank you to Tom and Jonathan for pulling this together. Just a little background on this presentation and more to come. During our Threatened and Endangered Species Policy Committee meetings for the last year, there's been much interest in better understanding species distribution models, their appropriate uses, better understanding when they may not be appropriate, what looks like a decision quality model, everything from that to better understanding all the nuances if you're going to hire in staff or contractors to do this sort of work for you, what you need to look for, how is it best applied to management and conservation actions, strategic deployment of resources, and those such things. And after hearing these conversations, Tom Edwards offered to put together this webinar and also some training opportunities for the State Fish and Wildlife Agency staff as well as some of the Fish and Wildlife Service folks. So here is a webinar to that end, and we will also be doing a similar presentation during our Threatened and Endangered Species Policy Committee meeting. I suspect it'll have a few updates and additional conversations. That list within the agenda is growing as we speak. So thank you very much for Jonathan's efforts and Tom Edwards' willingness to help us work through some of the growing pains of state agencies to better deploy some of the technology in appropriate ways to better manage species. I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Jen. Our presenter today is Dr. Thomas Edwards. He is research scientist and assistant leader for the USGS Co-op Research Unit in Utah. He has over 30 years experience in distribution and habitat modeling on a wide range of plant and animal species, including current work on modeling the distributions of plant species listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act, co-located with high-value energy extraction sites. At this point, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Dr. Edwards.
Okay, first, is my voice loud enough? Are people able to hear what I'm saying? Make sure that that's going well at the beginning.
You sound good.
Okay, all right, good. Well, I want to thank Jonathan and Jen and a whole host of other people. I'll be interspersing those I wish to thank throughout this presentation today, but particularly Jonathan, Jen, and John Organ was who brought us together. I've been bandying this idea about in my head for, 3 or 4 years now, having been so long in this, involved in these types of distribution models. And so I want to thank everybody for this opportunity. And I'll explain where we're going with this in terms of kind of a longer type of program. So let's go to the first slide. I'll just say next slide, Jonathan. Okay.
That'd be great.
This is kind of the classic what we're going to do. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about distributions modeling in general. And then I'll talk a little bit about some observations related to decision risk and the application of what I'm just going to euphemistically refer to as SDMs in management. Some of this is top 10 decision risk concerns as a starting point. The list is continually evolving through time. And then at the very end, close out with how we hope to try to address this for everybody's sake in the sense of some education and training platforms that we're working for. So next slide, please. So we're going to start from scratch, a little bit on some background of how these things are built. Next slide. Fundamentally, you got to get at the first question of why should we care? And I start this out with a very simple problem statement that the geographic range, oftentimes represented by a distribution model, of all species is integral to virtually all species-based decision processes. I cannot find very few examples wherein we do not have to know what a distribution of an organism is before we properly management. And here's just some examples that we see. In the lower left, we kind of see the thing you get with the Fish Wildlife Service eco range, or in their ECOS program out there. And I like to put this up as a hookless cactus. It's listed because I call this the angel blob. It kind of looks like one of those snow angels my kids used to make when they were little. Some of the other depictions you see on the right, at the top, kind of a generalized range. This is actually based on vetting by the plant ecologists in the state of Utah. And the two kind of southeastish sides of the maps there at roughly 3 and 6 o'clock down there are different types of distribution models that show these different things in terms of how this range. And so oftentimes, you see these types of depictions and you wonder how best to use them. Next slide. There's a lot of different ways these distribution models get applied, and a lot of times it's contingent upon the question as to why. Here's an example of likely locations how an invasive plant, the common mullein, had possible sites of ingress on into Lava Beds National Park. You kind of see the red there in the middle indicates the high likelihoods of where this plant was going to be. Now this model was driven by the National Park Service, who in particular wanted to have an efficient means to send the crews out carrying the 80 pounds of Roundup on their back where they could literally spray this particular plant. So part of what constrained the development of this model was inclusion of variables that could translate into management actions. And you can see that. Most of this boiled down to distance to roads as the best way to actually look at this. Next slide. This is also a very common. This is what you would probably call your classic habitat map. goshawk nesting habitat in the Intermountain West, in the Wasatch Uinta Range. This is a wide-ranging species where what we try to predict on the landscape out there through this distribution model is a single life history element, the nest site. Now this is often the time where people get very nervous and twitchy about these types of spatial maps, because that inset up there and all of that red does not, repeat, not imply that a nest is going to be found in each and every one of those locations. This type of model and application is still going to require boots on the ground, but by having this depiction of the forest structure that is associated with where goshawks nest, you can actually send biologists on out and do much more efficient searches for this particular critter. Next slide. Another application, very common one we see, is taking today's map and doing some sort of forecast model, oftentimes related to climate change. Although don't forget, a lot of these types of models, the forecast change does include human development, urban sprawl, for example, and things like this. And so oftentimes what we see is we generate a map of today, and then we build that model with variables that themselves are projected in the future so that we can kind of see. Oftentimes they call these things climate envelope models, as one example. Next slide, please. Here's an example, one that we're implementing in Utah, where these maps then are actually used to optimize consultation surveys in regions of oil and gas development. If you look at that blob in the middle right there, that represents a leasing, somewhere on the order of 6,000 wellheads we're going to go into that particular location inside there. Now the darker reddish color there indicates, based on the models, a high likelihood that the plant is going to be found there. The lighter shades up in the northeast part, 1 or 2 o'clock up in that area, has low likelihoods based on what we call concordance models of it being there. And the Fish Wildlife Service is actually using this and actually then allowing the energy corporations, and they're saying, you really need to go check in this area, and you don't necessarily have to go up in that area to do that. This is actually a fine-scaled resolution of that angel blob picture that I showed you. Historically, before, the Fish Wildlife Service required any place that blob touched that you had to go survey. So in essence, these types of models can also be used to optimize and increase efficiencies how we deal with endangered species. Next slide, please. All the ones I've shown you so far are spatial. This is actually a non-spatial model. So as strange as it sounds, the algorithmic tools used to build distribution models can also be used to predict what I will call, in this case, the frequencies of potential occupancy. So this is a non-spatial model that just says those species over there, and they were lichens of interest in the forest management plan over there. You can project the number of potential plots. In this case, it was 1 hectare resolution plots on the landscape where these plants are going to be found. Now, if you think about this for a second and you set this up in some sort of convenient sampling schema over time, you can actually start to keep tracks of plots occupied over time. So this is also another way that we sometimes look at that. Next slide. So those are examples of, to just kind of give folks a feel out there about how distribution models can, in effect, be used in management applications. However, working with Jonathan and Jen, as I've tried to solicit a lot of feedback from states in particular regarding why these types of models aren't used more than they are, I'm getting pushback, and a lot of it has to do with some uneasiness about the spatial components. So again, I always like to start here with important modeling caveats, and I want to make sure everybody understands that these extend, because I can build tons of those types of models that I just showed you. but there are some important caveats that go along with each one of these. Next slide. The first, I'm sure you've all heard some variation of this. All models are wrong, some are useful. George Box, a truly distinguished statistician in the arena of sampling design. And one of the things everybody needs to remember is what we're really striving for is models that are useful given a management application with a given intent. Next slide. Because these things are based on statistical operations that are applied to data, and as variously attributed to Benjamin Disraeli or Mark Twain, there are three kinds of lies: lies, damn lies, and statistics. Trust me, I teach statistics, and I've gotten very, very good at so-called statistical lies, if I can phrase it that way. Next slide. One of my favorite that kind of pokes fun at the statistics we employ nowadays, and some of you will probably recognize this quote, is that after 7.5 million years of statistical analysis, the answer to the meaning of life came back from deep thought. Next slide. Everybody know this answer? It was 42, cheerfully stolen from Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Now, part of the reason I like this, and you say, why 42? Sometimes we can do all these statistical analyses, and we think we're doing good science and stuff like that, but we get up with an answer of 42. So these are some caveats that I always make sure that people understand. Every talk I give on modeling, I include these three caveats so that people understand that there are limitations to all of these models, and these do in fact spill over into distribution models as well. Next slide. So again, why the caveats? Well, we forget these at the decision risk environments that we always live in. The caveats themselves do provide some operational and even what I will argue a little bit later on, philosophical bounds to the research and management that we are applying models to. These models are tools, and they will break, and a hammer can't always fix everything. And here's one of my more favorite, and this is a tough one to sell to some people in particular at times. There is literally no such thing as a best model, ever. Period, get over it. This is a philosophical point, but I think too often people approach these types of models with a belief that they are going to build a best model, or something is presented to them as the biggest, baddest, and best model. That's not true. You really need to evaluate all these things in the context of their usefulness relative to the question being asked. And of course, the last one down here is the caveats do poke an ironic fun at even what I will argue is perhaps overemphasis on statistics nowadays to the exclusion of common sense and sound ecological stories. So then, what are the issues as they relate specifically to distribution models? Next slide. Okay, we're back to my initial observation. Geographic range is an incredibly integral element to virtually all species-based decision processes. There are a ton of different ways we can generate these ranges. One of the more curious aspects of distribution models per se is that while the theoretical and conceptual bases for these are very well grounded in defensible published literature, their direct application to management and conservation of species lags. So this is what I was pondering for all these years. Why this lag? Why the lack of direct application? And of course, that's what then led to this entire process, which is where I got involved working with Jonathan and Jen to try to lean back from states and everybody else as to why are these things not as accepted. Think, for example, how rapidly occupancy estimation was incorporated from the literature into day-to-day management. And yet we've been building these types of habitat and distribution maps for decades, and they just haven't had as rapid of an acceptance. Next slide, please. So one of the ways we need to deal with these things is understand their models. It's an abstraction of perceived reality. They tend to be numerically based and centered around concepts of parsimony. Now, this is common to all model forms. I don't care whether you're doing population estimation, movement ecology, occupancy, harvest rates, pick your favorite. there's some sort of underlying model, statistical in most cases, for each and every single one of these. Distribution models are no different. Next slide, please. Well, one of the things that often does not happen when people present a distribution model is they forget that they are often derived from differing philosophical perspectives. We have three basic philosophies underlying this. One is Joseph Grinnell, the so-called Grinnellian niche. That is the fundamental basis of virtually all wildlife habitat relationships and the management that we perform on landscapes. I mean, that is it. We have Eltonian niches, where we think about functional roles in systems, keystone predators, and how their particular impacts will change distributions on landscapes. Yellowstone and the introduction of the wolf is perhaps one of the best examples we can find in North America over how the distributions of not only plants, but then the cascading effects of the food web were changed by that. Then we have the Hutchinsonian niche, and there's a curious kind of separation between Joseph Grinnell's niche and the Hutchinson niche, in that Grinnellian niches are mostly used for animals and Hutchinsonian are mostly used for plants. It's a very curious perspective. But one of the things I always ask when I'm looking at a distribution model I'm seeing right up front is the model builder approaching this from one of these different things? Because they're going to have taken different analytical processes. They're going to have done different things as they do that. And these different philosophical bases will affect the management questions and hence the risk that you are assuming when you try to apply one of these. Next, please. Well, this is how you build one of these graphically. I mean, we start with some sort of survey. Sometimes this is extant information, but nonetheless some sort of survey. We have presences and absences on landscapes. Sometimes we only have presences. We tend to organize those data. We link them inside a GIS environment to sets of predictors. And over there on number 3, we tend to ascertain statistical relationships. We pull those together, and from that we generate a map product, oftentimes the potential distribution map, and from there we draw inference for ecological understanding, and sometimes we then use these predictive maps for other types of things. And then the fifth step here involves validation processes or assessment processes or accuracy, however you want to refer to it. And oftentimes you can kind of see there's a little bit of a feedback loop over there between 5 feeding back to 3 to 4. Now that's just where most of it does occur, but what everybody needs to understand is that there are feedbacks amongst all of these 5 basic steps that do occur when one builds a model. Next slide, please. All right, so we've got that as kind of our background. So now we're going to try to see how do we assess the decision rate risk that's associated with these models. And I want to make sure everybody understands that this is a developing process right now that we're still undergoing, which is why it's so cool as we do this training thing. And the more information I get back from those who actually confront and deal with these types of models, the better I can fine-tune this process. So I'm going to put that request out right now. It doesn't have to be today, but you certainly have my email contacts, etc. You know, feel free to get back in touch with me, because I need to find out the ways that the types of risks people are concerned about, so that as the model builders construct these types of distribution models, we can build much of that stuff into the process. Next slide. So that's just a request out to everybody. All right. So reasons for the lack of application, I think, are related to a lack of understanding of the decision risk. They include, in general, but certainly are not limited to, a host of perceptions. One of the big ones I've encountered over time is so-called backroom constructions, where somebody builds one of these models, they scurry off to some back room, they build it, you are presented this at the conclusion and you have no idea what went into that model. Sometimes these things seem awfully complicated. There are often illogical projections into space, often outside known documented ranges, and the converse of that. Oftentimes you don't cover enough. A lot of this relates to what I call data siloing, where there's a ton of data out there, but it's siloed, and we don't necessarily share some of that information as well as we could. We also have a big issue I've learned in terms of output products that represent what I'll call an estimated or modeled range versus so-called known locations. There are groups of people who are understandably uneasy about making decisions on something that is a modeled versus a known location. Presentation sometimes of these models, it kind of comes across as the end point in information accrual. That is something that we need, that is a philosophy that we need to change, because these things should be viewed inside an adaptive/iterative type of process that you do that. One of the biggest favorite ones, of course, is the my favorite pixel syndrome here, where I've painted it blue, and you've actually been to that speck of land on the landscape, and you know it's red. And as a consequence of that one little error in the my favorite pixel, that then the entire map product basically is reduced in terms of its importance. Then there's tons of technical issues that are related to these types of things as they go along. So these are some generalities, and we'll see then how we break these down in terms of helping everybody work on the decision risk. Next slide. So this is often what you see. Okay, I've got all these products have plopped down on my table. So how do I comparatively evaluate among these different map products? Next slide. I wish to use these models, but what information should I, as a decision maker or end user of this model, know about these types of models? I mean, I have other things I need to do. I need to make a decision. I don't want to become a trained statistician. I get that. Next slide. These models seem different. How does that affect the decision environment that I'm associated with? I mean, there's a couple of big blobs, and there's a couple of stuff that has all these different painted colors out there. One of them has known and models shown together. How does that affect how I make a decision? Next slide. And again, we're back to the I get the known location, but a spatial model of estimated or predicted locations. Some people, I said, I've encountered just have serious problems with working with this. Next slide. So those represent just kind of some generic overviews. And based on some feedback that I've gotten back, this is kind of my biased top 10 decision risk. This list is continually evolving over time, which again, I get back to my request to hear back from people. Because a decision risk, as it being defined and used here, does derive from the phrase best practices. Best practices are rule sets, and they are in fact inherently subjective. I do believe people sometimes think that best practice represents the endpoint and that it lacks subjectivity associated with it. This is not true in a modeling environment. You can see this list. I'm not going to spend time going over all of these today. Some of them are plug and chug. There's big issues of uncertainty. There's data access and availability and a host of things like this. But all of these types of the decision risks with these models basically get back to these types of risk elements and the subjective decisions that are made and associated with them. Next slide, please. Okay, so many of these are common to any novel modeling approach, and at least in an initial approach to this, you can overcome these best by careful consideration as well as timely application to the conservation. So the goal of what we're trying to do here is meet and minimize these concerns and create decision quality distribution models. I think big chunks of this is going to rely on proper training and education, and that's where we're headed. So next slide. All right, so what constitutes these things? The framework's been laid for all of this stuff. Next slide. This is what we live and die by. Scientific defensibility in the United States is based on Dauber versus Merrill Dow. This is a Supreme Court decision, and there's a lot of lawyerly gobbledygook, but it boils down to these two parts. The techniques employed by the scientist, in this case our distribution modeling process, must be recognized in the scientific community. This is broadly defined as publications, focus of ongoing research, frequent types of use, and be relevant and reliable, that is, have application to the issue. Historically, U.S. judges have demonstrated or exhibited considerable latitude in accepting or rejecting the evidence that is presented in both of those two parts. Now, there's a third part to this that's basically case law, which presumes primacy of Fish and Wildlife Service supported analyses, say picking a model, over others. I make no comment on this type of thing. I do know this is currently under challenge, and you see my little footnote. I am not an attorney, but do on occasion find I agree with Shakespeare regarding them. I'll let you figure out what I mean by that. Next slide. Again, so here it is, the steps. Next slide. All right, so the decision risk then when a model builder is constructing a distribution model is based on these basic steps. There is a data acquisition, vetting, and organization. There's an actual construction. There's an assessment and validation. And there's an implementation component. So if we wish to get a handle on the decision risk, we need to have a process whereby all of these particular steps are documented and reviewed so that people can make their management decisions in the sense of the types of questions and the subjectivity that is associated with these. Now, analytical decisions are made at all of these steps, and there are many, many associated elements. This gets us back to best practices. Next slide. By definition, best practices generically is viewed as a procedure that's shown by research and experience to produce optimal results, and that is established or proposed as a standard suitable for widespread adoption. That sounds very familiar to the Dauber versus Merrill Dow, if you think about it. And here's some best practices kind of examples here. But one of the things I want everybody to walk away from here is that even though we use that phrase best practices, they are still based on subjective decisions, and they're often derived from what is an incredible breadth of sometimes conflicting literature out there. Here's an example. Which statistical model to select for a distribution model? Do I want to use a maximum entropy model, a logistic regression model, a random forest? There are many, many, many choices here, and there are many, many people who have drunk gallons of Kool-Aid and will fight to the death over their particular statistical model form as being the best practice. Another one is resampling data in appropriate form of model validation. Statistically, resampling assesses model bias. It is not a form of independent validation, says I, based on my statistical training out of the University of Florida. Another one, can I build a distribution model with 100 points? Yes, no, it depends. 42 works sometimes. The point being that you're going to see these types of things, you're going to pose these types of questions, and these are some of the answers you're going to get back. And they should make everybody who's building one of these models a little bit nervous. Next slide. Okay, so, but no single process to do this. So there's kind of some necessary steps. One of these things when assessing decision risk is to consider the form of risk, and the second is to increase our reliance on and requirement for the proper documentation of all of the analytical steps that we employ. Next slide. Okay, so how do we overcome these shortcomings? Next slide. Sorry guys, I was doing this as kind of a way to do this. When we look at the forms of decision risk, they're basically philosophical, technical, or intractable. These things, there is overlap amongst all of these, but it is useful to look at the decision sets, the best practices in this context. Here's an example, one I would argue is philosophical. The reliability of a modeled versus a known location. Well, this is my opinion, but you either believe in models and their potential for application and management, or you do not. You can see the green box over there. You don't like models. That's a philosophical stance, and I cannot help you. I mean, I'm not going to even spend time having these types of discussions on this type of thing. Next slide. Here's an example of a technical one. What we do a lot of times is take those continuous distribution maps, which are typically converted to a 0-1 likelihood of presence on the landscape, and there's a classification threshold that then turns that continuous map into a binary presence or absence. And there's lots of different ways by which you can select these threshold options. You can have intense discussion over this, but there are technical defensible solutions. So here's a case where a technical solution and resolution can be reached, and you can back this up with the type of appropriate literature. Next slide. Sometimes you can have both. You can have a philosophical choice of the statistical algorithm, and you can have a technical concern over historical data. How far back in time do I go, given, say, a heritage data structure that goes back to, 1967 or something along these lines? So sometimes these decisions can be both technical and philosophical, but oftentimes what happens when you begin mixing these things, what needs to be understood is no single end user is going to actually win 100% of their particular perspective when you're building these types of mixture models like that. Next slide. And some things are just intractable. If the data densities are insufficient for any distribution modeling right there, as you see down there in my opinion, be brutally honest. Don't push a non-defensible modeling environment. I see this occurring way, way, way too often. That at the beginning, when somebody posits that we wish to build a distribution model, they don't undergo some of this upfront analysis of some of this preliminary decision risk, and they turn around and try to push some sort of model. It gets out there on the landscape, and if you bring in a black hat, a white hat, or any shade of gray in between, you're setting yourself up for a really, really bad day in court, having been there before. So, next slide. So, what this does then is by starting out into these three types of groups, it begins to establish a structure by which the decision makers can in fact begin to assess the decision risk. And how might we then build this structure? Well, there's a list of concerns related to the distribution, creation, and application. That is what this large group of people right now actively engaged in this thing are starting to pull together. You can often have posed queries for the concern. There's an upcoming paper coming out in Bioscience that has some structure of this. We have one last iteration on the review of this type of thing. So these types of queries going back to the model builders can help you address these concerns. Oftentimes I find it convenient when I'm engaged in these things to ask the agency, the decision makers up front, do you have your a priori list or thresholds when you get uncomfortable making a decision about these types of things? So you start to see if we can build this type of structure right here as these models are being developed, put this into some sort of workbook that goes along with these models, then people can assess their comfort zone when it comes time to apply these in a management and conservation arena. Next slide. Oh, that's fine. Let's look at some examples right here. That's fine. So here's one that we oftentimes encounter. I'm only going to give a couple of examples so you can see how some of this structuring is developed. One of the big things we have is concern over the geographic versus environmental versus land tenure coverage. An ideal distribution map has both the geographic coverage and by default then the environmental coverage of how the underlying variables that determine where the plant or animal resides. On top of that, though, we have a ton of land tenure issues here in this country and worldwide that sometimes have impacts on how we determine the geographic. If it's based on land tenure, that means we don't have the full species range. So this type of transboundary coverage issues, this is something that should be considered up front when one is assessing the eventual decision risk. My own state right now is dealing with some sort of jumping mouse, of which about 30% of it's in Utah. The state of Idaho has one observation, and the bulk of the distribution and location information is in Nevada. This necessarily has to be a transboundary model up front, and my state people are working with the other two states as well to try to do that, to collect all of the data from everybody so that they have a defensible distribution map. Next slide. Let's consider some of these things right here. This is pinyon juniper, big time issue out here in western U.S. The red pinyon juniper, the green is conifers. Lots of different modeling domains there. The dark gray is what's called the Hadley dry cell domain in the western North American continent. If you look at the left edge spilling over into California, that's actually western juniper that spills over there, but it's outside the Hadley domain. Next slide. Sometimes what we do is we clip the boundaries, which is reasonable at the beginning right here, if that is a defensible decision. But notice what that does is that cuts out western juniper, at least on the California component of that. We also have issues. Canada clearly has no conifers. If you look north, all that dark green, they stop right there at the Canadian border. We know how realistic that is, right? Next slide. Oops, went too far. All right, here we go. We sometimes then buffer data. This is also a very common way we tend to look. So you can kind of see that lighter yellow is the buffered pinyon juniper. I've just showed one species of the common pinyon inside there as well. Next slide. But how this sometimes translates into decision risks. Let's assume that PJ management is of concern. Out here, there's a lot of concern over so-called PJ encroachment that is occurring out there. And so oftentimes people want these types of map products for pinyon juniper woodlands so that the decisions for restoration ecology can be done. Okay, here are some of the decisions. The SDM builder chose a buffered domain. What is the basis? This is a query. It's arbitrary, 50 kilometers. The SDM builder used only the Forest Service's FIA data. Are we missing other data? Yes, we are. Is that absence going to be an issue? No, FIA is design-based. The SDM builder included some PJ species that have geographic centers in Mexico and do extend into the U.S. Is this going to affect the SDM output? I'm not sure. Kind of see what I'm getting at right here is that each of these types of queries here gets back to a decision that is made by the SDM builder. And the neat thing about the feedback loop that we're trying to build here in terms of how these things should be built is if we can get a handle on the concerns decision makers have over issues, convert these into queries and questions, then the SDM builders will begin to address these types of questions as they build, and then we get a positive feedback loop on how the models are built. Next slide, please. This is how Tom would answer his bosses right here if they came back with these questions. The buffer, there's no literature basis for any buffer whatsoever. I checked with the PJ specialist and they didn't have an answer. We have to live with it. It's a high risk then to rely, I would argue, on that type of decision. Here's the FIA answer. The Forest Service FIA is design based in the continental U.S., hence we have both geographic and environmental coverage. This gives us maximum statistical defensibility. My risk then is low. The exclusion of Mexico. The PJ specialist states that Mexican PJ species are likely spatially commingled with the U.S. species. Hence, they will probably include them. There might be some risk, but I'm going to define it as moderate. So you can kind of see then how by embedding these queries up front as you build an answer, you're going to have a defensible basis when you then try to use this model in any type of management or conservation arena. Next slide. Another quick example right here. This is the single model realization. One of the unfortunate consequences of today's distribution models, and I'm equally guilty of it a long time ago. I'm not the only one. There's a ton of us trying to stop this from happening. Because what happens is you get a single space-time static distribution model. It is presented as fait accompli, and then it is somehow embedded in the psyche of management and conservation, and it creates problems because, remember, these things are not supposed to be single space-time static models. So there's some elements to consider. Are you looking at this in space or time? And sometimes this is resolvable. So here's an example. Historical data only was used to build the model. There is no commitment to future data collection. This is an intractable issue, in my opinion, right here. You either are going to accept the model or decide not to make a model, unless you change your decision in terms of finding resources to allow future data collection to proceed. Another example, data resources are sufficient to construct an initial SDM, but it's somewhat limited in space given our biologists' understanding. You can then use the distribution model as a hypothesized distribution and implement some sort of sampling schema to improve this thing over time. Yes, this will require resources, and that will be a decision that a decision maker would make based on the importance of these. You can also use these types of models when they're rich and generate so-called ensembles of models rather than just a single type of model. So you start to see some of the issues you can face up front when you're dealing with one of these first steps, the data organization, vetting, and acquisition. Next slide. So let's work our way through an example. The left-hand column is a maximum entropy. I call this my shark model. I love this hypothesized model right here. And you can kind of see the shades of brown inside there. The dark brown is the higher likelihood. On the right-hand side, we have another statistical model, random forest. We applied thresholds, and you can see the conclusion, the classifications down there. Now, both of these models are targeting the same general area. But if you look at the maximum entropy model, lower left, a bit more red than the random forest model on the right-hand side. Next slide. Well, what we can do to overcome some of these types of things is insist that people create ensembles of models. Remember my comment, there is no such thing as a single best model. This is why we should be doing ensembles of these types of models. And anytime anybody who's a decision maker and they receive a spatial distribution model and there is only a single iteration, my professional opinion, were it to be asked, is to outright reject it until they come back with an ensemble. And there's tons of econometrics literature as well as mathematical literature that says ensembles outperform single models at all times. So over there on the right, this is a concordance model, is what we sometimes call this. On the top one, you can kind of see you've got darker blobs. Now how this works is if you have, this is a stack of 5 models, but if you have 5, 10 models or something along these lines like this, and all 10 models point to the same spatial location, something's likely going on there, versus a single model that points out to some other type of location. The same way you can generate mean probabilities, which is what you have down there in the lower model there. Next slide, please. So here's how this might work in a decision risk evaluation environment. Okay, the SDM builder used 5 models. Why that number? Well, the code was available. Are others equally applicable? Yes. The SDM builder presents this concordance map depicting where the models overlap spatially. So for a given location or pixel on the landscape, how many models out of 5, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, or just 1, must predict at a spatial location for my management decision? Not provided. There's no measure of the uncertainty. Given 5 models, can the builder provide some measure of the variability in prediction? Yes, but not provided. Next slide. So here's how I would answer those queries that would come from the boss man, the boss lady out there. Well, the data are already organized so I can build more models. However, data densities were insufficient for 2 statistical model forms. In essence, what I've done is I've reduced the risk here by adding more models on into this type of environment, and I've actually been good enough as the model builder to turn around and say that I don't have sufficient data to do this. The next one, 5, 4, 3, 2, or 1, I'm punting to you, boss. This is entirely your call. I can build you separate maps of the spatial extent of 5, 4, 3, 2, or 1, but where you make that determination, 5, 4, 3, 2, or 1, is both above and outside my pay grade. I'm not a decision maker. So you can kind of see that in some cases, if we go to the example above, you can query back, and a model builder can reduce your feeling of risk, but at some point there's going to be risk, because somebody might say, well, I picked 3, and somebody else might say, well, why didn't you pick 4? So you see, sometimes there still is going to be measures of subjectivity associated with these types of things. No measure of uncertainty, oops, can do, will provide, and at the end we'll end up with some lower risk right there. So again, another example of how by formalizing the types of queries that would be applied to these types of models and forcing the model builders to do this, you're going to end up with a workbook of kind of the decision risk that you're going to make. And in some cases, as you can see in that middle example here, there's no answer as to how many models is going to be good enough for you to make a decision. You're just going to have to pick something that you're comfortable with. Next slide, please. Uh-oh. Oh, next slide, please. Oh, wait, right. So, all right, so how do I then ensure that this information is provided to me? Next slide. All right, so recall that right now we're dealing with issues of data acquisition, vetting and organization, construction, assessment, and validation. And here's the solution that we're working on and implementing right now. Next slide. Okay, we're going to build an education and training platform in terms of construction and evaluation. It targets model builders and decision makers. Right now it's relying heavily on experiential lessons, and this is where I have truly appreciated the help I've received from Jonathan and Jen in terms of reaching out to states. And this is kind of one of the first coming out parties, because I want more of this information to come back. Because we're going to try to then translate those experiences into this training and education platform. And as we do this, I want to make sure that this actually gets applied. So we're working with the states to try to have them select sets of species that they are identifying hopefully in association with Fish Wildlife Service. It could be WAP species, SSA, pre-listing. I don't particularly care. The point is, I don't want these to be airy-fairy, ivory white tower distribution models, but I want to have these types of models have direct application. Next slide. So there's the partnerships. AFWA, USGS is serving as facilitator. The National Conservation Training Center is going to help us get the word out in the education processes. One of the cool things is Fish Wildlife Service Ecological Services is actually providing personnel and monetary resources through its Species Range project to get this going. I'll explain a little bit more about what that means. Certainly the states, you guys own and have the data. In many cases, I know, at least my own state out here, it works with BLM, National Park Service, Forest Service, and you guys have these data. And what we want to do is train you guys in terms of how to build these types of things so that you can build these types of distribution models yourself. And of course, NatureServe, through its Heritage Program, is a logical partner as well. Next slide. How are we doing this? We have a decision makers course and a model builders course. The decision makers course I'm working on right now because I'm still gleaning information, but you're starting to see in today's webinar, hopefully, some of the direction that that's happening. We have a model builders course. This is for the GIS specialists, the biologists in the states, the staff who are literally going to be building these types of models. Next slide. You can skip this next slide in the interest of time, as well as the next one, because when I get about it, they're going to be blended. They're going to include real-world examples. These are not going to be the kind of classic statistical textbook examples where the world's normally distributed, things like that. Next slide. Okay, so here's the rollout. The Decision Makers course is being worked on right now. This is one of the first rollouts, and I only gave you a few of the examples today. As Jen mentioned, we're going to have another rollout at the North American this year, and we're probably going to try to finalize that by fall of 2019 at the AFWA meeting. The Model Builders course. Okay, we're starting with a Training the Trainers course through NCTC right now, but there are 3, possibly 4 participant-based courses on track for this calendar year. We're a little behind because of the furlough follies that myself and others had to endure a little bit while ago. But the first one of these is going to be in Bozeman in Montana in May of this year. The second will be housed physically at NCTC. The third in the Atlanta region in fall. All of these courses should have mixtures of state and federal biologists, but I'm really trying to get state biologists to these things as well. There's been interest expressed in a 4th course in 2019 up in the Northeast region. Now, one of the cool things I should let you guys know here, and we'll be mentioning this again at the North American, is those of you out in states who want to send specialists who would build these types of models, working through the Fish and Wildlife Service, the way we're fostering this right now is hotel and per diem will be covered at each of these locations. So you need only get your biologists to the actual location. This, I believe, just highlights how much Fish Wildlife Service really truly wants to invest in this. To go ahead and do that. So participant cost to get to this for the state, for those of you who are in on the seminar listening today as state people, is really just getting your appropriate biologist there. Now, what we will be doing at the North American is starting next week, we are going to send out the email blitzes about these particular course coverages. But we wanted to do this kind of first rollout webinar today. So I'm kind of really jazzed that the Fish Wildlife Service is seriously stepping up to the plate here to make these things. My ideal mixture from a state is 1 or 2 state biologists who have some sort of working relationship with a Fish and Wildlife Service or other agency individual in their location for a given species. I'd like them to come to these workshops and work as teams on an example. Now, I'm certainly not going to preclude anybody who comes from a state or another agency who just wants to come by themselves to this meeting, But to the extent we can get the state people working directly with somebody, and at least in my state, my biologists all know who their federal agency counterparts are, and they work with them all the time. I'm not going to say it's always an easy relationship, but they do, in fact, work with them. So that, in fact, is my ideal type of course participation. So next slide, I think, then, is where we are at the end here. As I mentioned at the beginning, and this is again is where AFWA has just been immensely helpful. Excuse me. We'll be sending out some email blitzes about this courses, as well as a way you guys can provide back to me some of the types of concerns, questions, or queries you may have about distribution models and their application to management. In particular, those of you with experiences, and I really want to hear the bad along with the good, so that we can begin to work on this structured modeling process whereby some of these potential concerns are addressed as the model builders build these types of models. So with that, I'll end, and depending on how Jonathan wants to run this, be happy to take some questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Tom. We really appreciate your time in providing us with this wonderful presentation. Just a couple notes before we go into the Q&A. This presentation has been recorded, and we will make that recording publicly available on AFWA's YouTube channel. If you go to google.com, and enter in AFWA, that's AFWA, and the words YouTube channel, the first thing that pops up will be our YouTube channel, and you'll be able to find recordings of this webinar and others that we've done with our federal partners on a wide range of scientific and wildlife disease and other topics. So it would invite you to access that recording, share the link with your friends and colleagues who may not have been able to attend today's webinar. So the way we're going to handle the Q&A, we recognize we're right at 1 hour right now, so what I will do is go through the comments that we've received in the comment box, which is available in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. I've got a queue of those here. We'll work through those, and I'll read the comments aloud, and Tom will have an opportunity to respond. And then if we get through those in a reasonable amount of time, we can open it up for Q&A from folks on the line. Bear in mind, we do have a very large number of people involved on the line today, and which is terrific and wonderful. So we'll start with the comments that we've received in the comment box first.
Jonathan, Tom here, real quick question. Yes. If we can't get through them all, can they still be transmitted to me somehow?
We can see if we can do that. I think what we'll do right now is we'll just start with the ones that we have, which is, I think, a manageable number, and then we'll see where we get to from there. First question is from Don Katnick. Are there fundamental data gaps that consistently limit SCMs that we need to invest in before we worry too much about building and evaluating models? Heavy reliance on heritage data, which can be very inconsistent from state to state, makes me uneasy.
Yes, and I agree. I'll start with the I agree part. One of the issues I've discovered is there's just way too much what I'm going to define data siloing that is out there. And I can't address that and glean at the national level, somebody like me. But what that does tell me is that if a decision is being made by a state to develop a distribution model of a particular sort, you really have to send the biologists have to dig down. In particular, since many of these things are transboundary, I fully understand that states many times are restricted, by the boundary. I get that part, but in many cases, a lot of these species are transboundary, and so the biologists need to reach on out to their colleagues elsewhere. I cannot speak to the access to the heritage-based data. Again, that's outside and above my pay grade. But I do believe that one of the issues of concern is data access and sharing that information out. I don't have a simple answer to that. The worst thing that happens is somebody builds a model with half the data, somebody comes in with another model with half the data from elsewhere and nobody wants to share and then build ensembles of model. There is nothing wrong if everybody has the same data with group 1 building its own model, group 2 building its own, because mathematically and algorithmically they are all going to point eventually to that blob. That was worked out by Laplace in 1790 mathematically. By way of a convenient analogy, anybody that owns a mutual fund, your money is managed by an ensemble of econometrics. As for consistency in data gaps and things like that, that is a consistently improving part over time. But the biggest issue faced, in my opinion, boils down to resolution, the grain on the landscape of many of these types of predictor layers. As ecologists, we understand how systems work, and we really want things down to the meter and sub-meter level and things like that. But if you're dealing with weather and climate data, you're at 800-meter resolutions already, and there's just not going to be improvement on those types of things. And so I think there needs to be some creative people working on better ways to downscale that type of data, and there have been tremendous strides forward in the last decade on that area. The one I encounter the most is soil. To me, that's just such a huge gap nationally, where one has reliable soil characteristics. But I'd be very interested in hearing if again, lists of data people wish, because that type of stuff can be bumped up food chains, and other people will work on it. Hopefully that answered that.
Great. Thank you very much, Tom. Question from Esther Rubin. Will the Models Builders course focus on specific modeling approaches?
Right now, in my teaching lexicon, I have example data sets for 12 very commonly applied statistical tools that range from parametric to semi-parametric to machine learning tools. Now, I cannot, of course, in a Model Builders course teach all of those, because each presentation is a minimum of an AM or a PM in terms of working towards them. However, all course participants will receive the PowerPoints and the coding that goes along with each and every one of these. One of the things not mentioned in my quick overview of the course, and will be more detailed later on, is that there is actually a pre-course meeting, the course, and post-course. The pre-course is to have the biologists with their own data set begin to peruse, following the structure I will provide them, their own data, what it is they need, what they're missing, some of the data structures they might not, some of the predictor data layers. Then they'll go to the course. Now, they might not be able to actually analyze their own data when they're there, but my examples are sufficiently robust. I will admit I'm weak on the aquatic side, and I'm working with some people to enhance that part right now, such that they will be able to go back with sufficient knowledge on these, what I would characterize graduate level knowledge in terms of how to build these models. And then the post-course part is hopefully the biologists who build these models will take what they learn in the course back with their data, and then we will be there, those of us who will be the trainers in this course will be there to help them when they have questions.
Great, thank you, Tom. Comment here from Ashley Grimsley, who says, as a state biologist in Arizona, I would enjoy a course in the Southwest. So maybe there's a possibility for collaboration with Region 2 of the service.
Yes, long term. Although one of the cool things that John Organ, before he retired, it's supported by JT, who's our now acting chief in the CRU system, and Kinsinger supports me all the way on up at their level. And Kevin Whalen, my supervisor out of Montana. The reason I'm mentioning all of those names is that they realize that this is my life. But and so that I've been released from a host of other types of issues, because they want to see this program work. However, about 4 courses a year is about the maximum that I can handle. So the intent is to have one of these, in the regional areas. I'm trying. So yes, but probably not till 2020. But again, if you can convince your boss, it's just a question of getting there. Like I said, once you get there, hotel and per diem are covered, because that's the Fish and Wildlife Service's contribution to this. So we're hoping that would help some of the people be able to attend the course by reducing some of the monetary issues.
Great, that's fantastic. Thank you, Tom. Question from Jen Schaefer. Tom, is that where species expertise can help build the model to make sure the most appropriate models are used in making decisions?
Correct. In the data acquisition, vetting, and organization stage, none of these models should be built without having knowledgeable biologists put into these types of things. Remember one of the concerns with the so-called plug-and-chug models? That's because when I teach the course, the first 2 full days, it might even be 2.5 days, deals exclusively with the data organization. And a lot of this has to do with processes by which you would select appropriate variables that relate to the organism you're trying to model, and variables that relate to the management question. Remember my Mullen classification tree? I could have built that entirely on environmental variables, but the Park Service wanted to know how to increase the efficiency of the people who were out looking for this invasive plant. So some so-called management variables were included in this as well. So that is a philosophical theme that is embedded throughout all the courses that I teach.
Terrific. Question from Mark Horner. Is a majority rule a good rule of thumb for the number of models?
Fish Wildlife Service out here, I built 5. They said 3. Oh, yeah, because they took the midpoint. But again, that is a good question. I do not know, to be honest. That's why I said that is one of the more subjective and hence high-risk types of things. One of the things that's beneficial that can come out is you can envision all the union maps where you would start with 5, you would start with 4, the union of 4, the union of 3, the union of 2, the union of all the 1s. So then you can start to see here, and you can almost create a topology of these maps. Now, if I was sending boots out into the field, and I wanted to actually do it, actually we are testing this as part of some of the rare plant stuff right there. I've got crews hitting the 5, 4s, the 3s, the 2s, and the 1s. But at this point in time, a majority rule would be as good as picking the midpoint. That's kind of how I would do it. Sorry, I can't give anything more.
No, that's great. Thank you, Tom. Question here from someone named Mike. This seems like it's a potentially over-conservative approach to decision risk when considering SDMs. When and how should decision makers consider the risk associated with making a decision without an SDM? For example, assume the organism does not occur where there are not direct observations.
Okay. I'm sorry, Mike. I'm not sure I understand by the over-conservative. Because I will say that it might be viewed as that, and that's just because my experiences and the scars on my back have placed me in circumstances where questions posed to me, either directly in court or through deposition, get converted to binary yeses and nos in many cases. And so I tend to approach this type of stuff from a maximizing the scientific defensibility type of perspective. I don't know how else to answer that other than that's just been my experiences. Regarding the modeled location but no known observations out there, None of this work is, in my opinion, no distribution model is intended to replace boots on the ground. If the species is of sufficient concern, and in many cases, I mean, you're going to have to send people on out. And there are many, many different ways. I'll tell you what, Jonathan, since you have those extra slides right there, why don't you zip me on down to slide 83, okay? On over, keep going, 80. Oh, there we are, right there. Okay, Mike, hopefully you're still there. I want you to look at this map. This is the hookless cactus. The green blobs represent the known. The reds represent where it's not found. That dark brown is the model distribution. At the lower left of that, you see that tentacle of green that is sticking out? Well, what we did, and this is represented by those blue dots inside there, since the botanist said, Tom, this is the generalized place that we're going to find this particular plant species out there. So we visited those locations, even where it wasn't predicted to be. Now, the reason the green tentacle in that at about 7 o'clock there grew was because we found some additional plants out there. This is where these models should be adaptive or iterative, because as we added more information, we actually modified the model over time. And then you notice how that green is largely encapsulated by the red around there? That's because when we went out, we implemented a sampling process that's called snowball sampling. You just start sampling where you find it until you don't. But this is an incredibly idealized, but this shows where you can go. Now, part of the reason this plant is, it is a listed plant, and it is smack dab in the middle of some of the highly desired leasing for natural gas and oil out there in eastern Utah. But you're right in the sense that you should always try to go sample where it's not. I mean, I know plenty of funny stories about where biologists think they know where the organism is, and they never go and test where it's not. And so any type of validation, particularly an independent validation, should include some samples where it is not, as well as samples where it is not where it is predicted to be, but we just haven't been there.
Great, thank you, Tom. Question here from Sarah Schweitzer. Can Bayesian statistical modeling be used to constantly correct a distribution model with newly obtained data?
Yes, one of my example modeling forms is what I would call a naive Bayes. It's not an incredibly sophisticated Bayesian type of approach. I mean, because those things can get super, super hairy and in terms of teaching. But yes, they can be done. That's part of the kind of adaptive, iterative type of process that can be applied.
Great, thank you. Question from Tara Nicholas on, shouldn't all data used for the models be publicly available? It shouldn't just be a black box.
That is my professional opinion, yes. And I realize that is a double-edged sword, but that is my professional opinion, that all these data should be made public. I recognize and understand that sometimes we fuzz things. And the examples often applied to me, for example, are falcon iris and things like that. But, the reality is, at least based on my DWR biologists who handle those permits, those people know where to go find a nest better than the biologist does. So why hide the location? I used to be kind of a bet, yeah, I understand that we need to silo this data, but I have to acknowledge that as I've started to consider this process more, I think these data information should be. And just in case people don't know, the Fish and Wildlife Service is actually starting to basically implement long-standing policies that were not fully implemented before. So if you want to contract out to them or something, or they want to contract to you, you are going to have to provide the raw data. Double-edged sword. I get it. I have a. I may even have. That's one of my examples. I know. Where is that particular example? Yeah. Nah. I mean, that's enough said. Okay.
Great. Thank you very much, Tom. Jeff Burgett says, there are a host of other caveats and potential queries associated with climate models. Given that most conservation decisions involve the future, do you think that you need to include other caveats for climate-informed SDMs?
To me, that would be I'm not saying what we're trying to do is come up with a list of what I'll call a minimal types of queries. And if you add certain other types of components in there, yes, you're going to have to add more things. So that's the simplest answer to them. And certainly, when it comes to the climate forecast models, what this means then, if I wish to do a climate forecast model, then that means my current day model, of course, has to have those particular variables inside them. Now, some things like soil or slope aspect, those are fixed, by and large on into the future. But if I'm going to build a forecast model, if that's my objective, then up front, the variables that I'm going to be vetting will have to include those. And then you're going to have to boil that down to, oh my goodness, at best I'm going to get a 1 kilometer resolution. And so if I wish then to include a climate forecast type of model here, understand you've just constrained your resolution in terms of where you're going to be heading off into the future. Because what will happen, and I got way too many examples of this is a resolution question, I'll just expand on it. If you start out with a 10-meter digital elevation model, just think about this for a second, and you put that inside 1 kilometer climate, you may in fact get differences in the topographic positioning of the organism, but they're all going to have the same climate variable. Ergo, which one's going to come out as a predictor variable? It ain't going to be the climate. And so you need to be aware of these types of things. And there's a whole section in the course we teach about, on the resolution stuff. But the general answer is yes, there are other types of caveats that go along with those particular, the application of climate change models. And which one of the GCMs you're going to select, because they all have regional differences, a host of things like that.
Great, thank you. We'll take 2 more questions here before we wrap up. We really appreciate folks staying on the line. And certainly if you have additional questions, please feel free to reach out to Tom. His email is on the screen right now, and I'm sure he'd be delighted to hear from you. The next to the last question is from Esther Rubin, who says, it seems that there needs to be a very important first step during which the manager/decision maker, the species expert, and the GIS analyst need to discuss the management need, including the purpose of the model, because this may guide the many decisions that need to be made during the modeling process. Do you have guidance on this, and will this be discussed in both of the courses?
Yes, I did not embed that into the course here, but into this particular thing. But you are absolutely correct. You don't just start building these models. You heard me say several times that what is the intent? What is this model going to be used for? You saw the example of the common mullen. That is going to turn around and drive some of the variables you want. If you want to do a forecast model, you're going to have to pick a GCM. So you're absolutely correct, and I do talk about that in the course. I just didn't do it here. It is absolutely one of the more vital steps.
Terrific. And the very last question is from Rebecca Peak, and this is a very practical question. How does one register for the courses?
Oh, that's the email blitz that will be coming out. I am going to rely on Jonathan and the OFWA network, through Jen and everybody else to get the word out that way. Please also feel free to get, the word. If you've seen this today and you've got other people in your agencies or other people you think might be interested, please feel free to distribute this as well. But we will be doing that next week. I'm about a month behind because of the furlough follies. I mean, I shouldn't apologize because it sure as hell wasn't my fault. But but yeah, that's the best I can do. But we will get that information out in the next 14 days.
Right. And I actually did have two questions come in at the last minute, Tom. With your permission, I'd like to see if we can't squeeze quick responses into these. One from Cherry Keller. Why is this called species distribution models when it seems like it is really habitat distribution models? Many species do not occupy all suitable habitat for various reasons, disease, predation, competition. So even if it perfectly displayed suitable habitat, the species may not occur there. Right.
I'm just using SDM as an acronym. The longer version of this type of thing, I talk about all of these types of things. The roots of this, you're absolutely correct, are habitat, range, and distribution modeling. But that just gets too big. I mean, that's it. I mean, I agree completely. You saw the example of the goshawk. That's actually a habitat model. That's not necessarily a species distribution model per se, because there's a single element that we're interested in, a nest. There's no way I can predict spatially the nesting likelihood of individual spruce fir and the appropriate conifer trees. I can't do that. But what I can do is give high likelihood locations, then boots on the ground, apply a non-spatial model. So you're right, yeah, it's just a lexicon I have to pick at some point in time. And I'm just using SDM right now as a shorthand acronym.
Terrific. And one final question from Julie Furman. You mentioned that sometimes you have presence-absence data and sometimes you just have presence. Would you speak a little bit more about the constraints of detection probability in making these models?
Okay. First off, there are modifications to this process for actually building a detection component in. However, if you wish to do a detection component in these models, you are constrained to parametric models. You will not be able to use semi-parametric. You will not be able to use machine learning types of tools. So there again, that's a decision that you would make up front, as a previous question had asked for that type of stuff. The detectability issue is kind of a tough one because we have tons of agile critters out there that are moving around and hiding from us, hence the whole field that arose in that particular area there. I'm going to argue back that a lot of it depends on the taxon. If you can't tell the difference between a lodgepole pine and a ponderosa pine, you probably shouldn't be out in the woods. So there's not a detectability or an identification issue associated with that. In the case of many of the vascular plants that I've dealt with in the past, the plant biologists have told me, this is the blooming window when you're looking for that tiny little orchid out there in the middle of that particular meadow. When it gets to many of the bird species and a lot of you don't have this issue with big-time mammals, of course, or some of the very low density types of organisms, yeah, it becomes an issue. There's no simple resolution to that type of stuff. One of the trade-offs, of course, is that if you want to use the detection, that typically means at the minimum 3 sample periods per point. So you're losing. So you got a decision to make. Do I want greater geographic coverage one time per year, or do I want to go ahead and actually estimate that detection part? If you've got a boss that'll give you 3 times the money, then do them both together. But that's very rarely the case. I don't have an easy answer to that one. I know a lot of people are struggling with that issue right now.
Great. Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you all of you for joining us in this afternoon's webinar. We'd like to thank Tom for the outstanding presentation and for providing us with all this wonderful information. As I mentioned, this webinar has been recorded. We will make the recording publicly available on AFWA's YouTube channel. Go to Google and type AFWA YouTube channel, and you will find links to all of our webinars, not just this one. We'd like to thank in particular our colleagues at USGS Ecosystems and Kinzinger, John J.T. Thompson, Kevin Whalen, and our good friend who recently retired, Dr. John Organ, for all of their support, for Tom's work, and for the engagement with AFWA on these important issues. We'd like to thank the Threatened and Endangered Species Policy Committee of the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies for their interest and for helping to get the process of these conversations going with Tom and these webinars and trainings more widely available. We'd also like to thank the AFWA Science and Research Committee for engaging on these issues as well. Before we close, I'd like to turn it over to my good friend and colleague Jen Mock-Schaefer from AFWA and see if she has any final words or thoughts for the group.
Thanks, Jonathan. Just to say that thank you very much, Tom, for all of the information, and I appreciate everyone's participation today. I know this is going to be an ongoing discussion about how states best utilize some of this technology within their agencies and in their decision making. And I'd also say I find it very interesting that the Fish and Wildlife Service has increased their attention-focused funding and staffing on species distribution models, specifically focused on habitat maps for listed species. I link that back to the other U.S. Supreme Court issues that were mentioned and deference to the Fish and Wildlife Service on their information and data in some of these court cases. So I do think it's of paramount importance that we keep up, stay up, and are able to better understand all the various aspects that are going into some of these habitat models, and that we can ask some very informed questions to make sure that if we're using a map for one purpose, such as under Section 7 or Section 10, that it makes a lot of sense in that context, as well as where we deploy our conservation resources. So to that end, thanks everyone for joining us, and look forward to continuing the dialogue and discussion.
Terrific.
Again,
thank you very much.
Well.
Yep. Thank you all very much, and this concludes today's webinar. Take care. Bye-bye.